This is Duke University.
Thanks for inviting me. There are a lot of people here who probably are pretty familiar with the kinds of things I'm going to say in the beginning. So if you are, bear with me for a little while. So I want to tell a few stories about Balzac, which is really what literary critics do all the time. So let me start off with a quote from Rachel Cusk. Any Rachel Cusk readers here? Great contemporary. Yeah, no, it's the same thing, same line I'm going to use about Balzac, but yeah, great contemporary novelist who's writing a trilogy. First is Outline, the next is Transit, and the third one she's still working on. Wonderful experiments with the narrator in this series. I just love these books. I've read them both twice in the last couple of weeks. So here's a quote from her. It was never said of history, for instance, that it shouldn't be talked about. On the contrary, in terms of history, silence was forgetting, and it was the thing people feared most of all when it was their own history that was at risk of being forgotten. And history really was invisible, though its monuments still stood. The making of the monuments was half of it, but the rest was interpretation. So I'm going to start off with monuments here. The Rodin statue of Balzac is just wonderful, and actually when I was going to Hopkins, one of his other statues, which is the nude statue, was in a cast of it was in the sculpture garden of the Baltimore Art Museum, and I used to walk past the garden going to Hopkins, but the thing was turned around toward the inside because that was where people saw the cast the statues in the statue garden. So his ass was toward me, and I had a friend, we used to go by and say, Balzac's ass again. So that monument, right, and we both ended up writing on Balzac, which is bizarre, but anyway. So that was the first monument, and this is the other monument I want to show today, which is the Gallimard Pléiade edition, which represents the quintessential place, I think, where all authors, French authors, but also international authors, come to die. That is, to be transformed into literary monuments, either forgotten or hopefully then maybe interpreted and reinterpreted. So I'm going to say a couple of things about the Human Comedy, which you all know is a long series of novels that deals with the Restoration and July Monarchy period in France, roughly between 1815 and 1840. And it's precisely because of this monumental work, the Human Comedy, that Balzac is considered one of the creators of the realist novel. So Balzac is in some sense the figure, that's too much, but a major figure in the first half of the 19th century. He was born in 1799, he died in 1850. He was still working on the Human Comedy when he died, of course. So this is the 12th volume of the collected edition of the Human Comedy. But as always happens with collected editions, decisions are made about what to put in there, even if it seems to be as simple as the Human Comedy, right? Because first of all, Balzac himself created a table of contents, which is kind of the basis for the edition. The Fern edition, the famous Fern edition, which he worked on between 1842 and 1848. This is a proof from that edition with his notes on them. And by the way, all printers hated Balzac because whenever they gave him proofs, they would come back worse than this, and they would have to redo them. So that's the Fern edition worked on by a proof of the Fern edition worked on by Balzac. So there's a pretty large body of Balzac work that preceded the Human Comedy. Depending on how you count, maybe around 8 novels that are completed or not completed before the Human Comedy, plus numerous essays and articles. That is youthful fiction published under pseudonyms that Balzac later did not want to include in the collected edition of his works, which was actually the Human Comedy. He didn't consider that what came before was worthy of putting in his collected works. And he hid behind 2 pseudonyms, and he also played around because he republished some of the novels in the mid-1830s under the pseudonym, so people wouldn't know it was actually him. So this edition is in no way collected works of Balzac, but nonetheless a so-called collected edition of the Human Comedy. Like any collected edition, as I was talking with Anne-Marie before we started today, it makes compromises, and it's always instructive to think about them, because a collected works or a collected edition of something really tells a version of what the editor of the collected works wants to say about an author's creative life, right? There's nothing ever definitive about a collected works edition. It's just simply that at certain moments, critics of a certain author will agree that the citational source for official articles on the author should come from such and such an edition, right? And I hate these editions with the passion because I'm old. And the typeface is absolutely almost unreadable for an older person. Not only that, but it's printed on onion skin paper, and the type from the back page kind of bleeds through when you're trying to read. So, in any case, this is an attempt at a collected works on a collected edition of the Human Comedy. So it's always instructive, I've always found, to look at the last volume, which is what this is, of a collected work of any sort, because the last volume turns out to be pretty interesting because it contains those things which didn't quite fit. In this case, drafts of non-completed novels, sketches, projects for novels. And Balzac died when he was 51 in 1850, and he had not finished the Human Comedy, and he would never have finished the Human Comedy because it's an ever-expanding project. And so, in some sense, to put sketches and incomplete drafts in the last volume is a gesture toward the ever-expanding universe of the Human Comedy, which was never going to end. So. The subtitle of this 12th volume is drafts and sketches, basically. But there are 3 essays in there also from a section which Balzac wanted to call analytic studies, right? These 3 short essays were not in the Fern edition table of contents, so Balzac didn't put them in himself, but they were put in then by the editors of the Pléiade edition in the last volume in a very curious way. And I'll give you the titles because I love them. Treatise on Elegant Living, Theory of Walking, and that's what I'm going to talk about today, and Theory of Modern Stimulants. So do you want to know what the modern stimulants are? You'll recognize them immediately. Alcohol, sugar, tea, coffee, and tobacco. Sounds very familiar, right? Balzac may or may not have been into hashish as Baudelaire was, but in any case, he was a consumer of all 5 of those things, and that's actually what killed him in the end. Overeating, overdrinking, and not sleeping enough, basically. So I'm going to talk to you today about one of those essays, The Theory of Walking. It's not a text people read very often. They read the Treatise on Elegant Living much more because there's a whole industry of critical writing on fashion in the 19th century now. So the Treatise on Elegant Living is at the center of a lot of those reflections, actually. The Theory of Walking is much less talked about. And I want to claim that it's a strikingly modern text in many ways. So that's my storyline. A neglected minor text becomes suddenly the center of attention, and I'm going to show you why. I'm going to demonstrate for all the Balzac readers out there, you may or may not be them, that you've all overlooked something really important, and I'm going to tell you a compelling story about it. So, okay, so I'm parodying myself because you have seen this line of argument in X number of conference papers, X number of journal articles. Some variation on that line is always the way you start. You have not seen something. So anyway, you put that line out there, and it immediately demands a story. Because if you're going to keep telling an audience about a text they've never read, then they're going to start pulling their iPhones out really fast if you don't tell a story that gets their attention, right? So you better deliver on that kind of story, because no one reads this text. You haven't read this text. You probably haven't read a whole lot of Balzac anyway. And so what do we do when we actually say, oh, you should have read this text? So I have to at least describe it in broad terms, because otherwise we're not going to get anywhere. So let me say a couple of things about theory of walking. And by the way, the translation is really hard to do, because démarche is the word in French, and it means a lot of different things. And so you just have to kind of give up on the semantic richness of the term. But anyway, so it's about a 40-page essay in this edition, which I can read with my magnifying glass. And Balzac starts off by claiming that no one has ever taken the time to study how people walk. So he puts aside the biomechanical approach right away, and he concentrates on the social nature of the way one walks and moves. That is, I would say, on the affect, and I say affect carefully here, that a manner of walking creates in a viewer. So the way one walks reveals something about who one is. It, if you want to put it crudely, sets off vibes, and I'm going to come back to this later on, in the viewer, right? Walking, which is a part of what I would call myself generally the notion of gesture, okay? And that's not a word that Balzac uses, is a social performance learned mimetically in social exchange. And that's the way Balzac approaches the question here. One can practice and change at least some elements of one's gait, but there's a limit. A commoner, for example, can never pass as a noble. If you watch him or her walk in the street, you can recognize immediately that this is someone trying to pass for somebody else. And you know who the people who pass the best for other people in Balzac's mind are prostitutes, okay? Truthfully. Anyway, so walking and moving in a public space is a combination of unconscious and conscious things, elements, right? And Balzac doesn't use those terms either, because those are end of 19th century terms, conscious and unconscious. But he clearly indicates that part of our gesture profile, if you will let me describe it that way, is not subject to our conscious control. He presents himself as a scientist and philosopher, and I really think Balzac was a pretty deep philosopher myself, actually, who assures his reader right away that his observations are scientific, and they come from sitting on the boulevards that were beginning to be cut through Paris. I mean, this is in the 1820s, and we know the boulevards mainly as the Haussmann phenomenon of the 50s and 60s, but they were already in the process of being built. That's the Rue de Rivoli, which is one of the earlier cross-axes in Paris, and that perspective is taken from a place which is probably near the end of where it had been constructed to at that point, right? He's an observer who sits and watches or walks himself on these boulevards and observes how people walk and tries to make sense of it, right? And he finally will say there's an ideal way of moving, and basically he will claim that there should never be nervous or quick movements. Everything has to be slow and smooth and soft, right? Basically, that's the way you make people think that you actually are someone worthwhile. Okay, so those are the basics of the essay. Okay, so I mean, it's really a curious thing to do in 1832-33 to write an essay about what people look like when they walk and how it affects the people who are in their social space with them. It's a pretty impressive sort of idea, and there's Balzac as the walker with his cane, and there's a flaneur, a walker, the first question you have to ask, the first story you have to tell about this essay is, where does it fit into Balzac's literary career, his biography, we'll put it that way, right? So I'm going to construct some concentric circles, which are not separable from each other, obviously, but I'm going to kind of artificially separate them here. So where does this fit into Balzac's literary career? There's a biographical story to be told about where this text comes from. And first of all, Balzac was a literary laborer, okay? He had wanted to become a writer by the time he was 20, in 1819 or 1820. And he spent the decade of the 1820 to 1830 years trying his hand at just about everything. He wrote these novels that he denied writing afterwards. He wrote essays. He tried to become a publisher, printer. He tried everything, and not with very much success. But he did discover that there was a genre that seemed to work well, and namely those are the short essays on social behavior for newspapers or literary magazines. A genre that in some sense combines analysis with recommendations about how to perform in social circumstances. So there's an early treatise on dressing codes. There's another one on society as a terrain for theft and fraud and how you deal with the lawyers who are trying to steal from you. There's an essay on birthright and inheritance law. There's an essay on the rights of authors. I mean, there are a lot of these short essays that he was a master at. And so really, he had discovered that there was a reading public for something that took the place, broadly speaking, one might say, of the classic courtly manuals on behavior. The norms of behavior that were emerging in bourgeois society, especially in urban bourgeois society, hadn't yet been codified, couldn't easily be taught. So people were kind of hungry to know the best tips about how they should act in certain circumstances. And Balzac was a very astute observer and very good at parodying, at being humoristic about this, but also at having important things to say about what things people need to think about when they're actually in social space. Well, the publishers found out quickly that Balzac was really good at writing these essays. So, Theory of Walking is an essay that he signed a contract for in 1832, so it was already a little later, for the Revue de Paris, the Paris Review, in its first version. And that contract said that he had to give the review 40 pages of text a month. Doesn't sound like a lot, but he had other contracts that he'd signed, so he was like turning out the pages as fast as he could. So I say he's a literary laborer, and I think that's the best caricature I've seen of him, doing that sort of thing. So the editors of the Paris Review knew nothing about what this essay was going to be. He just gave him a title, Theory of Walking. They weren't very happy because he didn't deliver for a long time. The contract was signed in November 1832, and the essay appeared in a couple of installments at the end of August and beginning of September in 1833. So he was really late, and there's an exchange of correspondence that's really interesting about trying to get him to honor his contract. But he was always late because he was always overcommitted. So it's just pretty typical of his practice. So that's the kind of basic biographical tale, which is really interesting if you're a Balzac specialist. Because you could say that in some sense this was the training to become the novelist that he was to become, and the social commentary would become a part of his project in the human comedy. So, so there's a broader question of historical context in a broader sense, right? You could say that then these essays, like courtly manuals of behavior in the preceding royal regime, were necessary especially in large urban areas where people were coming together in ways that were never the case before. a large percentage of the French population actually lived a rural life before the Restoration, and Paris and Lyon and other cities began to get larger after or during and after the Napoleonic era, actually. And so people found themselves together in ways that they hadn't been together before. So if you're living a rural life, your social life is basically limited to a circle, the diameter of which is where you can walk easily in a day or two, which means that the number of people you come into contact is pretty small, and often very limited to your own family, since people gave parcels of farms to their sons, along the way. So I would just interject here that the French philosopher Paul Virilio, whom I love reading, has pointed out that the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Empire that followed were moments when French peasants who had never seen anything but their immediate rural environment actually took to the roads of France and Europe and discovered that there was a big world out there, a wider world out there. And Balzac returns to these characters of Napoleonic veterans often in the human comedy, because the soldier who'd been in these wars didn't want to go home, because going home was to go back to the farm. So you find them in all sorts of places in Paris, and in Balzac's work in particular. They're often the guardians of offices or buildings or something like that, so that when people get through the door, they have to go past the guy who's asking them what they're doing there. And there's a really funny example in Balzac's famous Lost Illusions novel, where the main character is trying to find a newspaper where he wants to work, and he runs into one of these veterans at the door who says, "It's not here, it's everywhere, the newspaper. It's written in all different places. Why are you coming here?" It's a really funny scene where Lucien, who's the main character, is trying to figure out what it means that the newspaper doesn't have a place. But anyway, so you'll find these things, these people everywhere. And the point is that they were ending up in urban environments because they really didn't want to go back, but they were among others who were ending up in those environments. So in the 1820s, urban dwellers were confronted by crowds. This is pretty common stuff that they didn't know, strangers whose identities they had no idea about, and they couldn't discern who they were. So the question was how to decide, who these people were, how to read the signs, in some sense of the people that one encountered in these crowded streets. And if you know anything about French history, it's really interesting to see how the walkers and the carriages share the space, because sidewalks are not particularly common. The boulevards were the places where the sidewalks actually began. People getting run into by carriages or whipped by the drivers was a pretty common experience, actually. So again, then this is the broader historical story to tell about this urbanization that Balzac participated in and tried to interpret and interpreted for other people through writing these short essays, right? And they did play into his career as a novelist, because he's well known in his realist writing as a commentator on social questions of all sorts. I mean, the third-person narrator in Balzac's novels is going to comment on society all the time, quite unlike Flaubert, who in both Madame Bovary and the Sentimental Education kind of gave up that sort of social commentary and let it be much more implicit. So those are indispensable elements that, I'm not original in any sense in telling you this. This is the kind of the context in which a critic who's writing about Balzac has to work. So, you have to be aware of these things, and you put them out there. So I want to move to another layer of stories here, which is the stories that critics tell to each other. And that's why I kind of parodied myself when I said, you haven't read this important minor work that no one else knows anything about. There's a certain, it's not that no one has read Theory of Walking, but it's been read and it's been talked about, but not as much as many other things in Balzac. But there's a certain genealogical thread concerning the origin of the text, the theoretical kind of context in which Balzac was thinking this, which is a little beyond the biographical and social, although they're certainly related to them because we can talk about what Balzac read and what he, what he studied in school or whatever. But there's a theory of social interaction that somehow is in the back of Balzac's mind, or in the front of his mind as he wrote this text. And the theory of walking has been read as an illustration of the theory of physiognomy. That pseudoscience, and I use the term really consciously, championed and of course developed by the Swiss thinker and poet Johann Caspar Lavater, right? Who published a treatise on physiognomy in between 1775 and 1778, which really made a big splash, actually, largely because the illustrations were so impressive, right? That's Lavater, and that's a page from the treatise on physiognomy. So the claim of the theory was that one could read the character of individuals on the traits of their faces. So it was an idea that people revealed who they were by the way they looked. And for someone like Balzac, who again is seeking ways to discern differences between people in these crowds that all looked alike, I mean, how do you find out how people are different? He was certainly impressed by that, and he uses the word physiognomy right away when he starts writing this essay. He puts himself in that tradition pretty quickly. But there's another dimension to this. I mean, physiognomy is also a kind of novelistic tool because he created literally thousands of fictional characters in the human comedy. And, he has to distinguish among them. And so he uses, in some sense, partially uses anyway, the notion of physiognomy to describe the faces and make the memory of the reader recognize the differences among the characters, right? And actually, it's really funny because the last volume of the Human Comedy has two very long indices, I should say. One is the index of fictional characters, and one is the index of historical characters. And they're both equally long. And I think it was D'Alembert maybe who wrote a very witty essay on how you distinguish between a fictional character and a historical character. I mean, if you put an historical character in a novel, is it really an historical character? And it's a really funny essay, and I was looking for it the other day. I can't remember. I think it was Lucien D'Alembert, who's part of the Geneva School of Literary Critics, but I couldn't find it. So in any case, there is this kind of theoretical framework of physiognomy, which is in the background of Balzac's, I should say in the foreground of Balzac's thinking about how you analyze the way people walk. So I'm not going to contest that genealogy. I'm just going to present another strand, which I don't think has been sufficiently emphasized. Of course, that's my new story, right? And it all goes back to Rousseau and Diderot, which I'll briefly say a couple of things about. Don't have time to go into detail here. And it has to do with touch and touching at a distance on one hand, and the nature of affect, feeling, on the other. So first, Rousseau, the famous portrait. He was a tough guy to get along with and wasn't as nice as the portrait makes him out to be. But early in the essay on the origin of languages, Rousseau makes a very interesting remark. It's a foundational point about how we interact socially. So this is that quote. The usual means through which we act on the senses of others are limited to two: movement and voice. The action of movement is either immediate through touch or mediate through gesture. Touch, limited by the length of one's arm, cannot communicate at a distance. Gesture, on the other hand, is effective as far as one can see. So as a parenthesis, I would invite you to think about cinema emerging at the end of the century. It's the first place where gesture is out of the field of vision. So that's why someone like Agamben talks so much about cinema and gesture. Okay, touching at a distance is gesturing, and cinema is the first place where you can actually do that thousands of kilometers away, right? Okay, that's for another day. All right, so one can either speak to the other, or one can touch the other, and then touch can be imagined as an extension, gesture can be imagined as an extension of touching at a distance. So I really want to claim very carefully that gesture is not a supplement to speech or to language. It belongs to a system of touch for acting on the other, or for creating, if you want to put it this way, affective reactions in the other that's different from the symbolic system of language. So when people say gesture, you immediately imagine the speaker, like me, moving his or her hands or making gestures or pointing to something. You immediately imagine gesture as a kind of supplement to speaking into language. That's not at all how Rousseau presents it here. And he's well aware that there's an unconscious dimension to gesture. And he'll remark, for example, and I'll quote him, "Our gestures signify our natural unrest." So they can be nervous in nature too, right? Or in a further comment, passions have their gestures, but they also have their accents. And these accents thrill us. Our voice cannot hide them, and they penetrate into our heart, carrying with them, despite ourselves, the very movements that make us feel what we hear. For Rousseau, then, even our vocal accents are part of the gesture system, not part of a system of symbolic meaning related to language, but rather purveyors and conveyors of feeling. At stake, I would say then here, is a current of social exchange that is independent of language, and that's fundamentally important in how we react to others beyond what they're saying, right? You can think of many examples where you were listening to somebody's speech and the gesture profile was so distasteful that you couldn't even concentrate on what the person was saying. Or the opposite, the gestures were so inviting that you would take anything that the person said, right? So that's kind of what I'm getting at here. Gesture, touching at a distance, is fundamentally important for creating reactions, that is, actions that kind of correspond to and vibrate with what someone is saying or doing, right? And then the second thread, which I don't really have time to get into in detail here either, is Diderot. And I want to just quote in his entry, not the complete entry, but part of the entry on affect, which is really affection in the Encyclopédie, and I'm translating it liberally here to bring it into my story. I may be wrong, but anyway, it's the way it is. But this is the encyclopedia. You know, the encyclopedia was that great Enlightenment publication where all of human knowledge, was put into this. And Diderot wrote and probably 40% of the entries, something like that. And he certainly wrote the one on affect. So, affect can be understood generally as the impressions of beings, internal or external, on our soul. But more commonly, affect is said to be the feeling of strong pleasure or aversion that objects, whatever they are, bring about within us. Such is our understanding that in this state of mind, which causes love or hatred, taste or distaste, muscle movements occur in the body where, according to appearances, they provoke the intensifying or the diminishing of these feelings. In this respect, we are like musical instruments whose strings are stretched taut. External objects act like bows on these strings, so that each of us produces sounds that are higher or lower. So it's a really complicated text to pull apart, and you can see that the language is certainly a language of the 18th century, but I'm hearing it as a contemporary language about movement. So to summarize then, if you want to put it in one sentence, internal musculature is like taut strings on which the gestures and accents of others act to create vibrations. Okay? So I can't, again, go into detail here, but I would just immediately make the connection. Rousseau and Diderot are attempting to describe what we call today, when we talk about affect theory, what that affect might actually consist of, right? Those fundamental and important actions, movements, accents in the framework of social interaction that can't be reduced to language and symbol, because they're not illuminated by conscious thought, and thus they don't belong to analytic thought processes, okay? But I would go further still, and again, I don't have time to answer to all these claims. It's sometimes much more fun to make claims than it is to actually answer to them. But since Husserl, through Merleau-Ponty, and more recently in neuroscience, we have been analyzing body movement, how the body situates itself in the world through movement, how we are, in fact, embodied in space, right? And we've discovered that perceived gesture and movement in someone with whom we are interacting actually triggers neuronal schemas, that imitate what would be activated for those same movements if we were to accomplish them, even if we don't follow through and actually do the physical actions, right? Mirror neurons, but also certain other systems of proprioception that come into action here. So we are, through a tradition of phenomenology and into neuroscience, in fact, going right into those areas that Rousseau and Diderot are talking about, and that Balzac picks up on in Theory of Walking. Because he says clearly, I'm not talking about the biomechanics of walking, I'm talking about what the perceiver, what the effect and affect on the perceiver is of the way someone moves through urban space, right? So Diderot and Rousseau say this in very metaphorical ways, but those metaphors are in fact pretty on target, I would say. Strikingly close to the way that we kind of conceive of embodiment and embodied cognition today. So I'm thinking, for example, of Sean Gallagher, Alain Berthoz, and Guillemette Bolens, for example. And those are three really interesting essays on issues that are related to this. Okay, so my claim then is the strand that really is interesting in Theory of Walking is that strand and not the physiognomy strand. The physiognomy strand, I think, it's Rancière who called it in one of his essays on Baudelaire a pseudoscience. It's not really a science, but it's very helpful for a novelist like Balzac, who's creating so many fictional characters, to kind of frame the way he distinguishes among them, right? Now I would say, and then I really don't have time to go into this today, that there's a further path one needs to pursue if one wants to go down this path, a further direction in some sense, that would transit through the idea of animal magnetism proposed by Mesmer. You probably know who that is, François Antoine Mesmer, in the 18th century, who lived into the 19th century, and who had this theory that was simultaneously a scientific proposal about a mysterious magnetic fluid that flowed between people, but also a social theory about how people interact. And Balzac knew Mesmer's work very well, and in fact believed a lot of what Mesmer said. And he cites Mesmer immediately in Theory of Walking. So physiognomy and Mesmer appear both in his text in the first pages of his argument, right? But if we go down the Mesmer path, then we're going to go all the way to hypnosis and the emergence of psychoanalysis, okay? And I think it's possible to do. And I think that eventually Mesmer was quashed in French scientific circles, largely by d'Alembert and his group, on the order of the king, because it was kind of politically questionable to talk about social interaction that didn't pass through the king in some ways, that wasn't very hierarchically organized. And in fact, the social dimension of interaction in social circles was just as important a dimension of Mesmer's work as the scientific claims. eventually. So, Rousseau, Diderot, Mesmer, and Balzac. That's kind of what I'm saying. There's a, this is a marginal text, the theory of walking, but I think one of the most interesting philosophical texts, actually, that Balzac wrote. Here's my claim. That's my line. It doesn't. I mean, the way I approach the text doesn't replace the social history and the biographical importance of where this text fits into Balzac's life and into the way he saw his society. But for me, it's much more interesting to think about the way this connects both with theories of touch in the 18th century and theories of embodiment in the 20th and 21st century. And I would say, just to close here, that Michel Serres, the French philosopher, once said that the history of science was very far from linear. In fact, he said, it proceeds more like a spiral that doubles back on itself and reactivates parts of abandoned perspectives that were potential, that contained potential, but were set aside and not, let's say, didn't win the battle, the social battle of what theories are actually acceptable. So I would say that in a related manner, and I certainly wouldn't consider myself to be a scientist, but literary critics do the same thing. They double back on stories that others have told and find ways that actually reactivate and re-energize those preceding stories. So, hope I haven't taken too much of your time. So I end up really saying, and I could really say in a shocking way, at stake here is never the truth. It's just convincing stories. And that's a kind of Stanley Fish-like comment. And it's a dangerous comment to make in our fake news, false fact environment. Alternate fact environment. But you know as well as I do that there are no facts. There are only things that occur that fit into narratives that we tell about ourselves or about our society, because otherwise there wouldn't be any way to understand them. So a fact is never alone. It's always in the framework of.
It's called then an evidence rather than a fact.
Yeah. Something like that.
Once it's gone through a process.
Yeah. Of discussion with people who have thought about the same things. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 So it's a dangerous thing to say, but I mean, there's no truth in literary criticism. Is that actually being? There's only stories that we tell, more or less convincing.
I just have a quick question for you, David. So from my medieval perspective, I'm just curious about this because of this essay I'm revising right now. Does he ever touch on or use as a ground of comparison animal gaits?
Yes, absolutely.
Horses and dogs are moving
absolutely.
Ways, and they are trained to do that.
No question.
And there's a system of vibrant and complex communication between humans and particularly domesticated animals.
Absolutely.
Passes language entirely.
Yeah. What Balzac, and he definitely talks about animals at a certain point in this essay. What he will say is that you want to know what natural, uncontrived movement is? Look at animals, basically. So the animal ends up being an ideal for movement that is it's not consciously thought and consciously tried to be changed.
But
that's his perspective, right?
Because that's not actually what happens.
Exactly. Yeah. And sheep actually recognize each other's faces frequently. Yeah.
So they have to be non-domestic,
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's the difference.
Yeah.
Or dogs that are highly prized because they're trained to be highly to comply, and their gestures show.
No question. Anyway, no question. My daughter's cockapoo asks to be petted by going like that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, but in this essay, which is kind of a normal gesture. Sorry to use the term again, but a normal way of thinking about things. The animal will end up being the ideal of movement that's not herky-jerky and interfered with by too much conscious thought.
Well, that's just such an interesting way to see.
Yeah.
To naturalize animals.
Yeah.
And the communication between humans and animals in that way.
Yeah.
piggyback quickly on this. There's a whole body of literature on dog cognition that has to do with how dogs interpret human gestures.
No question.
Right? And that dogs supposedly exceptional ability to recognize something like pointing, right, as opposed to wolves
or vocal accent, as Rousseau would say, right? Of course, yeah. I mean, I never really got into this that much until my daughter bought a cockapoo, which is the smartest animal I've ever known. And that, there is a spectrum between human and animal cognition. There's no line. Basically, that's
I've been reading the Livre de Chasse by Gaston Feubeau.
Yes.
14th century.
Yes.
Hunting dogs, basically.
Well, and also, I mean,
it's about other things too, but about how you train, and it's about so that these are really, really highly educated animals that are in a symbiosis, in a system of communication with the hunter.
Yeah, there's just to push Rachel Cusk again, there's a chapter. She goes to Athens to teach a writing course. And one of the sessions, she asked them, the people in the writing course, to say something about animals or to write a text about animals. And actually, I'm sorry, this is actually in Transit. I'm sorry, it's in the second novel. But this writing group, somebody says, "Oh, I have a dog, and it's beautiful." And the woman says, not Cusk, because she would never do this, but one of the other students says, "Well, describe it. Tell us about it. You're a writer. You can't just do that." And the guy's completely frozen up, and Rachel's narrator, whose name is Faye, mentioned once in outline and once in Transit, turns to the guy and says, "How did you get this dog?" And he launches into this story. It's a North African variety that was used by aristocrats in North Africa to hunt, and it's a dog that runs in packs with two dogs leading. One of them looks at the falcon and follows the falcon. And when that dog gets too tired, because it's really hard to track the falcon, the dog will hand off to the other dog who will track the falcon. And they do this, they're trained to do this, and they do it in an incredible way. Anyway, so the narrator's point is, don't do this old writing seminar kind of thing by telling me to describe or tell the story. She says, "Where did you get the dog?" But suddenly, boom, this incredible story opens up. So. Yeah. Balzac is definitely naturalizing animals here. And, it comes up. Because the problem is being too conscious about what you're doing, actually.
So, super fascinating. And I was just tweeting you, that's all. But that's why I was on my phone. But I was listening. And,
you're not the iPhone person who turned off to the line about.
wasn't shopping. But there were two threads that I really would love to hear more about. But one was, I was just thinking how when you're talking about Rousseau and Diderot, I was thinking actually Blanchot makes very similar kinds of claims about seeing at a distance, right? The fascination with the image, and so it does seem like that lineage is really, there's a kind of lineage that's really interesting and clear in French thought. But I don't know if it struck some of, like Chenin or Carlos, but that there's also that much earlier moment thinking about sort of classical Chinese Book of Rites. It's actually a very similar notion of neurocognition and fake it till you make it, and walking, sort of
absolutely
external gate kind of creating internal.
Yeah.
And so anyway, so I just thought that there seems to be this really interesting trajectory that would be fun to hear more about. But actually, I want to more follow up on where you began, because you talked about collections, you talked about editors creating, and so I really want to hear more about how that notion of the editorial stamp on thinking about Balzac, and this volume, which was actually serialized and published in the newspaper. So I was just wondering,
right.
Like, you can talk about the context of the news, like what? I was just curious about that.
Yeah.
That connection.
That's a much longer story and an absolutely fascinating one. Yes. So the 1820s is the rise of the cheaper newspaper press, obviously in France, and it gets even better in the 30s and 40s. So one could, you know this very well, one could claim that the rise of the realist novel is really the rise of the serial novel that's published in parts in newspaper or journal format or review format before it comes out in the end. So that poses enormous problems for any editor who wants to, I mean, so what you end up is these huge annotated, footnote parts of these volumes where people show off their knowledge. And so, it's impossible with Balzac because there were so many versions of the proofs that were then thrown out, because they were not worthwhile. And that's only the let's publish it in a volume kind of moment. There were pieces of these novels that came out piece by piece. And when he puts them together, he obviously rewrites the novel, So, this is not like the Flaubert establishment looking at the manuscripts of Flaubert.
I was just thinking, because if this person appeared in a newspaper, so in some ways, what is the interaction there? And
so there's this
canon text, right?
Exactly. But there's also a system of how you grab the attention of the reader of a chunk in a newspaper, which means that you recast the novel because you're not doing quite the same thing. How do you write a piece of a novel so that the reader is hooked and also ready to read the next? Or if someone comes in without reading the preceding chunk, how do you get them in anyway? Because they're not necessarily going to have, because it may have disappeared from the public library kind of setup where newspapers were often read, and you can't get back to that first chunk. So that's a huge, it's just kind of invisible. You can do that for small pieces, but you can't.
It's really interesting to think of that in terms of history of publication.
Yeah.
Where it's a post-print revision process, and it's a little bit like serialized TV where you have to say previously on, right?
Yeah.
It is that
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, it's related to that, yeah.
Different, so it might come out more as a personal.
So one last comment.
Oh, sorry.
When the À la recherche du temps perdu came out in the second play-out edition, I was not going to read the goddamn thing. Reading it in the first play-out edition had a note system, right? But the second play-out edition is twice as long, and half of it is, drafts and crap that came. Give me a break. What? If you're not a specialist, you're just not going to do it. But I bought the edition, and now I go back and read the other edition because I can't stand the notion.
Who reads? In some ways, is that the way anybody reads anything? So it is where great writers go to die, like the guy with my play-out edition, right?
This is what medievals do all the time.
Yeah.
Yes. They create an apparatus.
Yes.
Apparatus.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's the critical edition. You're supposed to show everybody everything. There's a scholarly philological standard.
But it's not readerly, right? It's
No,
not,
absolutely not readerly.
It's, the notes are at the end, and you can read this edition just by reading the text if you have a vision that doesn't force you to use a magnifying glass, because the print is so small, and it's also on onion paper, so it kind of bleeds through from the back page and makes it hard to read.
It would be perfect to digitize. They should be so that you can blow up font.
I have gone back and forth about digitized reading, actually. I forgot the guy's name. A really interesting theoretician of this decided he would read nothing but digital versions of text for a couple of years, and because he was really into the notion that things should be distributable and really they should you should be able to read that way. So, and he wrote a good essay. I have to find these two essays because they're back to back. One is about how you publish digitally to make it readable, and the other is I'm leaving digital reading and going back to books. And what he basically says is that the lockup on the format by Amazon has meant that people cannot actually format digital reading in ways that would be really original and interesting to do. It's locked up. You can't experiment.
All of the affordances of the medium and the platform
are excluded.
Right. For reasons of property.
Yeah, exactly. Think about how long it took the Kindle books to be paginated, and how you stumble across a new Kindle book now that it isn't even yet paginated, right? So, I mean, you know, so he basically argues enough already. I mean, if you can't do the book in an interesting way in a digital format, it's much more interesting for me to read in the other format because I can do things with it, you know, and I can make it work for me. I can't make this. I mean, I put the Rachel Cusk quote up there. I bought the Kindle version after the paper version, and this pagination, wonderful. At least I can quote her without having to go back to the paper version. But I much enjoyed reading the paper version, and I'll do searches on the digital version, but I don't really like it that much. So
all of e-books is collapsing in various markets. It's minus 15% in the last few years.
Yeah.
It plateaued and then it's going down.
Yeah. And basically it's a very thoughtful essay where he says, look, there's so much potential here. You could have a picture of books on a shelf, point to it, pull down the book and open it up. You could do things like that in the digital environment. But no, it's locked up. So, but you know, the funny thing about French criticism in the 19th century is that people, and I won't name names, focused on Flaubert's manuscripts because he wasn't like Balzac. I mean, they were published, you know, were they published serially? I can't remember whether Madame Bovary, no, it wasn't published serially, no.
Si, puisqu'il y a eu l'attaque.
Yeah.
Because the trial was because of the publication in La Revue des Deux Mondes.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And there was this big hullabaloo because Flaubert accused the editors to having already
exactly. Yeah, exactly. But there are manuscripts.
Excerpt.
Yeah.
It was not feuilleton, it was excerpt.
Yeah. So there are kind of original manuscripts of Flaubert's writing of these novels. Sentimental Education and Madame Bovary in particular. And so when the French literary establishment saw the theory people getting a handle on French literature over in the States, they turned to manuscript study. You can't do that with Balzac. There are manuscripts, but I mean, of what version and, you know, and when? He was basically a recycler. I mean, constant recycler. In the Fern edition, he recycled the proofs, you know, he kind of rewrote things. The one novel where you can detect the cracks in the rewriting is The Wild Ass's Skin, which he didn't really get quite fused together. So there really are three parts to that novel, and you can see clearly that he didn't really get the apparatus correct, but he learned that lesson. That was probably the early, I think it's the Les Chouans, Les Chouans, I don't know what the English title is, the earliest, but The Wild Ass's Skin is probably the second earliest or third earliest of the novels in the human comedy. And he just hadn't kind of ramped up the system yet. I mean, he would go out, have nice dinners and spend time, come back at midnight and start drinking coffee and writing. So that he killed himself when he was 51. Hugo was born in 1802, and he died in 1878. So he's kind of the long 19th century. Balzac is really the emblematic figure of the first half of the century, which was a radical publishing rearrangement, for sure.
How about the illustrations? Because if you're going to talk about gesture, if you're going to talk about la démarche and this action at a distance, or even physiognomy, what is the status of illustration in Théorie de la Démarche?
You know, I haven't seen the early edition. I have to go to Gallica.
But you have lost some?
Yeah, I would have to go back to Gallica and take a look, And it's not sure that the illustrations, or there wouldn't have been many in the newspaper or review version of this because of the cost. But I don't know.
Or or any engravings done
Yeah.
afterwards.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Have to do that, yeah. Won't claim to have done that.
So I was to bring it back to the walking and the gesture. And framing this is probably going to have a bit of a personal story in it, but when you were talking about how to move through urban Paris, it reminds me of how to move through, learning to move through London as someone who lived there. And it's rapid. You know where you're going. You move quickly. You don't stop for tourists. It's like, I'm going where I'm going. And then spending time in Rome, and we haven't had time here, so she can corroborate this or not, but being taught, slow down, bella figura. For me, the history of what is the connection, and that is a performance of, I don't know what, right? But it was a real moment for me when somebody said, okay, this is how you move through Rome.
Yeah.
And you're creating a different impression by being a Londoner here. If you want to look like you belong and like you spend time, and it's very elegant and it's slowed down. And I don't know whether that's related to that, is that cultural moment that you have, that I've noticed in Italy, where you have the perambulation, that moment in the early evening where you go and you walk around. Right, and you're seen. So that was one thread that I was thinking of, and then also the long history of physiognomy that's used from the ancient world that is also kind of national. And so that's where my threads kind of intertwine. Because and I don't know how much of that is in Balzac, if he's very interested in French in Paris, in urban Paris, but that history of how you try to say the Bretons are like this. I was trying to think of the ancient world. And the Catalans are so, and this is what they look like. And this is, I don't know if it goes, I don't know how far into gesture it goes. There's that longer history that is ancient of trying to categorize by physical appearance.
Yeah, it is an ancient tradition.
Neither of those are questions. But
No, I mean, obviously, I have to limit the scope a bit, even in my own work, because I can't really, go all the way back like that. But so I think Lavater is really the crucial figure for Balzac, because that treatise was available and had a really great impact on people, largely because it was aesthetically pleasing. People had, and also, kind of footnote to that is that we're getting into the period of what's it called, the kind of engraving that's on stone, oh shoot, what?
The hieroglyphics?
I should know the name. There's a technical name for reproducing images on stone and
lithography.
Lithography, yes. Lithography is invented at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, and I'm sure that has an effect on things too, because it was the first time that people could actually reproduce paintings and people could see them in lithographic form. And when they couldn't go to a museum, I mean, very few people went to museums in the period. So the great works of art, for example, started being reproduced in lithography. And I'm sure that had an effect also on observation of faces. I mean, it's tied together, I think.
I was just going to say, I love the gesture that you made, for lack of a better word. And also that you brought in this idea of cinema, and then the affect and the walking, and it would just be amazing to have him alive today looking at augmented reality and reading whatever. To have, because there's been some really interesting studies on, you even mentioned them, the ways that the VR and AR, your body is effectively sort of moving through the space.
Absolutely.
Mirror neurons.
Absolutely.
Have him talk about that. I love, but talk about the circle that you like bringing Balzac back.
No, I mean, that's why it's interesting that Balzac is into this, because he's already into this, and that's what I want to, that's.
Revive him for a moment.
He's strikingly modern, whatever you want to say, right?
The people who were doing the défilé, do they look back to his work?
It's funny that Tim Ingold cites a passage from Balzac in one of his collection, the second collection of essays, because and Agamben also cites this essay, but in a derogative way. he says we're going to have to wait till Gilles de Tourette comes aboard with mechanical image making in the second half of the century before we can actually talk about movement usefully. So he dismisses theory of walking. So I guess it's between Tim Ingold and Agamben that I really started seeing, no, this can't be one or the other. There's something going on here. So it's not like I read this essay and, you know, had a moment of enlightenment. I had Ingold on one side and Agamben on the other. And, you know, I never really deeply understood what Agamben was saying about gesture until I started thinking about this. This is the first time in history where gesture can be thousands of kilometers away. So cinema really is the medium of gesture, as Agamben says, right? Because Rousseau's only talking about people who are within range of your vision, basically.
What about gesture that is described in fiction?
Absolutely.
So you have to imagine it, but
yeah.
sometimes...
Bolen's essay, which I really like, on that list, talks about description of movement and effect of movement as it's described on you, and there's kind of two different levels. And so her claim would be that, you know, when you when movement is described, it's activating these circuits, okay? And you know, when I think about the scene in the Charterhouse of Parma where Fabrice meets Clélia for the first time when he's in, you know, he's in a carriage with his mother and his aunt, and they stop and get out and walk, and Clélia comes walking up, and at a certain point she trips and falls into his arms. Well, yeah, but we've all saved someone from falling, and that's the deep part of what happens when you read a passage like that. Even the description is not enough. It's the impact on you, kind of reactivating movements that you have actually, you know, unconsciously learned.
It seems like people do neuroscience-like studies on the effects on the brain of reading something that involves gesture.
They are a word of caution about neuroscience. MRIs are extremely limiting. There's a careful limit on what you can actually ask somebody to do in that chamber, because and reading a passage about movement is a pretty complicated affair. So you'd have to really abstractly.
We had a group at Duke demonstrate this, where someone was reading, and you had people who were wired up, and I don't know how scientific, because it's hilarious to watch. I videotape it on my phone. I remember it.
Yeah, I'm very skeptical of those things. First of all, Len White, who's my neuroscience friend here, is really a wonderful humanist himself. Always says MRIs are the tip of an iceberg. There's a huge iceberg below. That the brain is a distributed system. So the fact that something happens in one region of the brain, you know, when you do a certain action, and not in another, you know, is okay. It's a trace of something, but exactly what is it? And the second thing is that those images you see have gone through statistical filters where every moment is a decision about what's an outlier and what's not an outlier. So I'm not a good enough mathematician, but if you have someone describe to you how the images are produced, you see that at every turn a methodological decision was made about what is important and what's an outlier. And so you have to take them, you have to understand, when somebody says, oh, Science published an article that says that if you learn languages, you're smarter, okay? No. I think we are, but and no MRI is going to prove that to me, right? So I'm careful about that. They're very impressive, and they're actually for the general public. But if you start peeling back the layers of analysis, you see that the mathematicians have to make decisions about what's the outlier and what's not. And that's fine. You know, those are decisions about what you think the structure might be. But it's a proposal, it's not the truth about how your brain is functioning. So I once asked a neuroscientist in France how he found all these these people to do these experiments for him, and he said, "Oh, I always use the same people." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, it's hard to train them." And I said, "Well, what's the long-term effect of being bombarded with magnetism in the cylinder of the MRI?" And he said, "I don't know." Did you see the story recently of somebody who turned on an MRI machine in India, and there was somebody with an oxygen tank walking by, and the guy got sucked into the machine?
Oh, right, I saw that.
Yeah. I assume that your brain waves must have some sort of effect on this. But anyway, so even that, I mean, you can't just find anybody off the street and train them about how to comport themselves in an MRI. So I understand on one hand that it's an incredible technology, but I understand on the other hand that you have to take them very carefully, I think, and think about them.
Did you have one more thing?
But I can wait and talk to Dave.
Any other burning questions? Before we thank Dave, they're really fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you.